livestock. It's part of African heritage. So today I'm going to be examining the issue pertaining to sustaining small ruminant in the tropical region. It means the place that is very hot, the hotter places. In the tropical, as you know, that there are two. In most cases, people experience two seasons. It's a rainy season and a dry season. That's a usual season that you find in tropical. In this presentation, I'm going to be paying specific attention to the goat. A small ruminant, I'm referring to the goat. Why goat? The goat are very important because everybody can afford a goat. So in rural area, you must make sure that you take care of your goat. And this goat, especially indigenous goat are very important in the sense that they are affordable and they can be able to survive in the harsh environment in the rural areas. Because you got to understand that when you talk about ruminant, you cannot divorce it or separate it from ruminant nutrition subjects, because the good need to be fed. As I said, in the tropical, there are two seasons, dry and a rainy season. So in most cases, indigenous goat need to be taken care of, especially in the rural areas. So when it comes to feedings, because you need to differentiate between different ruminants. The cows are not the same as sheep. So therefore, they deserve to be given different feedings. So mixing with the different breed, there's an element of genetic diversities when it comes to South African indigenous goat population. They actually diversify, which means that breed actually is designed for providing meat. So during the time of colonialism, the colonial government used to employ inspectors to travel to the rural areas, whereby they were able to castrate the goats that were not useful and to allow indigenous breed to do what? To sustain indigenous breed. But in the post-colonial Africa, many African governments were not able to control livestock. If you go to rural area, you find there's no dipping where you can remove ticks, where goat can remove ticks or stuff like that. So which is also a problem. But during the colonial government basically what they did, they installed boreholes in the forest. They appointed inspectors to look after breeding of livestock or invasive species that will affect the breeding of indigenous goat. But you got to understand that the difference between goat as well as the cow are big, so they are browsers. They browse the grass, whereas the goat are very small because they've got narrow muzzles and articulated lip structures. This goat, therefore, the goat are selective browsers. They are selective browsers, so they have ability to browse various plants and shrubs and survive in harsh environment, unlike goat. So that's why goat can survive everywhere. Because in South Africa, you know that South African grassland is under pressure. In fact, some of this grassland area is no longer used for communal purposes. Rural areas. So we need to have a sustainable ways to provide our goat with food or nutrition. I come to conclusion that in order to sustain our goat, because goat can be afforded by everybody, we need to have a sustainable feeding where we can produce forage. So because as I said, poor breeding are dominating everywhere, because the research station are no longer there to give people advice. So in my view, with a view of mitigating the effect of the drought in rural area, to look at how can we, because we live in the drought-prone regions, where we suffer overgrazing and the poor usage of land. And land management still a big problem, especially grazing land. It's remain thorny areas, and it's also becoming problematic. So therefore, we need to design a system whereby our goat will survive, because we don't even practice rotational grazing. Disparately, especially in the bushveld and tropical, of them they have knowledge, but because of the pressure to sustain their livestock, they have to do everything in order to feed their livestock. To feed livestock, you need to prioritize the nutritive values where you can feed this animal, because the tropical plants in our area, as you can see, that are important to determine the nutritive values, especially the things related to vegetations, especially natural vegetation, and crop residue are very important. We must also pay attention to multi-purpose trees as a form of designing future forage. Because if you look at the goat, grazing on non-arable land is seasonal, and the places consist of the same species of the trees. And then you see, this is very important. This make things difficult for our livestock to survive, because ruminant usually select leaves when consuming woody, plants and thorn and leaf. You see, this is very important, because when crop residue from the maize and sorghum and millet can be used to feed livestock, that will help us, because it also helps us to increase productivities, livestock productivities. I personally believe that attention should be given to natural variation in the nutritive values of untreated crops residue as influenced by species. Because if you look at in most cases, especially in the rural Africas, there is the high humidity and rain and during after harvest, basically, to be honest, it's caused deterioration of nutrient values. I think the solution will be that the crop residue from leguminous be grown as a dual-purpose crop for both grain as well as the forage production. Instead of buying, we can grow them instead of buying, Because I understand that many people don't trust legume crops, but we can grow them and then we use them for feeding, especially during the dry season. But there's no doubt that crop residue will continue to become important feed resources in a place like rural area, especially Africa, tropical areas. And also increase income for the small farmers, because small farmers, they don't have money to buy forage for feeding purpose. You see, I understand that the major constraints is the scarcity of land and as well as competition with food crops. Those and the issue of the harvesting and adequate supply or production of seeds, because people don't have resources for that. But I think this constraint basically can be overcome by simple thing, by introducing multi-purpose fodder trees, and then actually planting in the village garden, even the villages. Leguminous fodder trees have potential to be used as a high quality supplement, no doubt about that. I think the simple feeding system based on combination of fodder trees and cereal crop residue can provide productive ration for ruminants. Because to be honest, people are suffering, farmers are suffering, especially during the dry season. Because in most cases, our goat in rural areas, they rely on leaves of syrups and branches of the tree. You can see them going there doing selective of them. But in most cases, in rural areas, there are some trees, especially these trees like acacia trees. There are a lot of them, So this tree can help us to yield a livestock productivity. Yeah. And maize, issue of maize, we can also plant them for the sake of feeding cattle, because maize crop residue account for many majority, or maybe less than 40% of residue available in Africa. I understand that some of the species may be agronomically successful but unsuitable for feeding livestock in rural areas, because you cannot introduce the species that you can't plant things that you know that at the end, during the cultivation, you can't use them to feed your cattle. Because in this what I'm trying to say, that it sounds like animal science or ruminant nutrition, but people will ask, why today you are talking about the ruminant nutrition. In that area, there's a need to develop sustainable feeding for animals, because animals during the winters, they suffer a lot. Farmers, you'll see farmers going up and down. You got to remember that to understand how ruminant survive in rural area, you need to understand the geography where you introduce these species. And we must also preserve what I've learned. The indigenous goat survived. So this new breed that is introduced in rural areas is detrimental, not only for environment. It's more like invasive species. I'm sorry, not all of them, but what I've seen is that unlike the indigenous goat, or where you open the kraal and they go to the forest to look for forage or plants or shrubs for feeding, this new breed cannot go outside. It's always around the houses. It's unable to feed itself. It needs to be provided. You have to go and buy forage. For my point here, however, is that the best way to sustain your goat or small ruminant, I advise you that invest on indigenous goat. Indigenous goat can go and graze and forage in the forest. The new breed cannot go outside. It relies on feedings. And the worst part of it is like this. During April-May season, after rain, foot and mouth diseases. But that one is not a big issue, because it can just heal, it can disappear, without being cured. But what I'm trying to say is that to sustain small ruminant in rural areas, especially in Africa, requires disciplinary knowledge. So you need to combine different expertise, because farmers, unlike in the past, where you could just farm for the sake of farming, today farm is a science. It's always been the science, because you need to breed. So to protect your small ruminant in rural area, you need to bear in mind that in rural area today, the breed that is dominating rural areas is not actually sustainable. It cannot grow. It relies on feeding, which means you have to buy a forage regularly so that it can able to survive. Without it cannot survive on natural vegetation. It doesn't want to go there. When you open the kraal, it just browse around the houses. But indigenous goat, once you open the goat there, you can even use a dog to look after indigenous as a shepherd for indigenous goat, because the thing is that even like I said, we need to emphasize the issue of nutritional values, and also design, the feed that can help us, the feeding system that can be able to sustain our goat, especially in rural areas. This poor breed that is dominating rural areas is not sustainable. We need to preserve indigenous goat for the future of saving our money, because the issue of animals, I know that this has to do with animal science, and why you are going that, because in rural areas, many people are organic scientists. So I'm actually basically encouraging citizen science, that people in rural areas should be able to understand their breed. Because around July and August, that's where the problem comes. It dries. You need to buy forage to feed goats. And that's the time when the goats are giving birth to kids. Where are you going to feed them so that they can be able to produce a milk? Because we as a black people, we know that milk are very, very important for goat. Even today, the indigenous milk are found in the big cities. Actually, goat milk are found in the cities. Masuya Khasele, Amadila, Alebese are sold in the upmarket stores. Where if you ask a black person in the big city or township, Masuya Khasele King, they only know Lebese. Don't know Madila. So the point is that we need to invest in the indigenous knowledge system in order to sustain our indigenous goals. In doing so, this may be help us, and this designing this, maybe there is a great potential actually for increasing productivity of indigenous livestock. I recommended forage lagoon, and another one I also like it is the issue of encouraging using the issue of maize, sorghum, and millet. We plow them for the purpose of feedings. Because the issue, things like your tropical terroir are very important. But the crop residue from these leguminous crops are very important, including those cowpea. They can be used, they're very important. As well as pine nuts. Pine nuts are also important. Are also important feed resources. We need to know that. Especially the season, like dry season, our goat are suffering, and we must also take care of when you have got a small kid. Don't expose them to environment, winter environment. You need to take them and put them in warm environment in the evening. So that's what I can say today. I just feel like I need to talk about the issue of our animal livestock in relation to the feedings, especially when it comes to sustaining small ruminant. In the tropical region of Africa, we really need to sustain them because bit by bit we're losing indigenous goat. The new breed is not sustainable. It's required to feed. You need to buy forage. Do you get my point? You really need to purchase forage regularly. These poor breed are consuming a lot as compared to African indigenous goat that rely on wild vegetation. This one needs forage, guys. So therefore, we need to encourage our farmers to invest in indigenous goat. That's what I can say for today. I'm still going to discuss these issues of sustaining indigenous goat. Thank you very much. Sharp, sharp.